Next slide. This is the schedule that you've seen several times. Today, we're presenting the preliminary capacity results. So you can see the, oh, no, you can't. Oh, I just started talking without the presentation. Anyway, so you can go to the next slide. And you'll see a very familiar schedule when that happens. Oop, there we go. So look for that. You are here, arrow pointing up. The capacity results and the housing needs analysis is what's coming next. We had a momentous date just last week was when our proposals from cities for expansions were due on Friday, and we received one from the city of Sherwood as expected. So you can see that we're getting towards the end of the navy blue line, and that means that all this data is coming together to inform the urban growth report. So go to the next slide. You know that the urban growth report has three main parts. We talked last time that we were here with you about demand, so growth in the region, and we talked about economic forecasts and demographic changes in the region and the country. So that's all about demand. This proposal that we have from Sherwood, you'll learn more about that coming up in the next few months, and that's about readiness. Today, we're focused on capacity. So it's about the capacity inside the boundary to accept growth that's coming. And that's the analysis that these folks to my left are going to talk about today. After the urban growth report comes out at the end of June is when the decision-making process will start. And this information will become packaged and put together with ranges, and the council will then discuss those ranges and figure out where you want to land and make your decision by December. So with that, I'll pass it off to the rest of the team. I think Ted has the next slide. So next slide, please.
Good morning, Council President Peterson, councilors. As Erin mentioned, I'm Ted Reed with your Planning, Development, and Research Department. I'm going to give you a little bit of context for the results you're going to see, just so that you can have that bigger picture in mind. The first thing is that we've been trying to improve how we do this work every time we do this in a growth management decision, really trying to capture market factors that influence redevelopment and infill over the next 20 years. But you'll see as we do that of course we have to make some assumptions about what the market may do, and those can be volatile over time. So we want to make sure that you understand that as part of this context, but also that we do this work at a regional scale. So while we try to get it just right, our goal is to have it right at the regional scale, not necessarily specifically right for every single parcel in the region. There are over 500,000 tax lots in the urban growth boundary. So we need to keep that regional scale in mind. And getting back to both of these, we know that there's some uncertainty looking out 20 years and what the market might do. So we present these results as a range to be very clear about that uncertainty. And the other way we deal with uncertainty is we submit this to review by all of our city and county partners to get their feedback. Next slide, please. What the law asks us to do is to understand how much room for growth there is inside the urban growth boundary. It asks us to look back, what kinds of development have happened in past years. It also asks us to look forward at the trends in density and housing mix that might change over time, because we know that you know, as we're looking forward 20 years, we can't simply rely on what has happened in the past. So we need to understand those future market factors over the 20-year time horizon. Next slide. You're going to hear from Clint and Becky about three types of residential capacity that we have counted. The first, Clint is going to cover, it's vacant and partially vacant land. That one is pretty self-explanatory. Parcels that have little or no improvement on them. The second category is redevelopment. You're going to hear from Becky from Eco Northwest about that. The modeling that our consultant team has been doing to estimate redevelopment potential over 20 years. And then the last piece is what we call new urban areas that Clint will cover again. These are areas that have been added to the boundary from 2018 onward that don't necessarily have urban level zoning. So think of Tiger River Terrace that this council added to the boundary as part of the exchange last year. And what we're not counting here, I should note, you all probably know the story of the former city of Damascus. There's a large portion of that area to the east of the former city of Damascus that is not feasible in the next 20 years to serve with infrastructure, particularly sanitary sewer. We're not counting that. So thousands of acres of buildable land, but we're not counting capacity there. Next slide. I don't want to get into details of this. This is just a schematic of how we treat these different sources of residential capacity. So we sort, first of all, into vacant and developed land. We remove certain lands because of environmental constraints or because they're simply not available for residential development. So think of homeowners associations, common areas, for instance. We use a generalized zoning classification that's based on local zoning codes to figure out what is allowable on those pieces of land. And then, as you'll hear from Becky and Clint, we treat vacant land, developed land, and new urban areas a little bit differently to come up with that estimate of capacity. And I'll pause here. I think next slide is just a question slide. Any questions about big overview before we get into results?
Councilor Lewis. Sure, I guess, you know, we're doing this for the first time since 2001. So potentially unlimited redevelopment potential in neighborhoods for ADUs and, you know, more compact urban scale development. Are we using anything other than the back casting? Are we talking to mortgage financiers, that sort of thing, to figure out how many people are actually taking advantage? How are we modeling for what might actually be happening?
Thank you, Councilor Lewis. So House Bill 2001 did sort of change the playing field for what's possible in existing neighborhoods. Clint and Becky will get into that a little bit about how we estimate middle housing potential, if we can answer that in a few minutes.
Sorry, I jumped ahead.
No, that's okay.
I thought that's where we were. That's where we're going. Okay.
Seeing no other hands raised, go ahead.
All right. I think the next slide is Becky's.
Yeah, so Ted mentioned that one of the ways that we understand the capacity of the urban growth boundary is using a pro forma model. And so that is a model that tries to reflect what a sort of typical developer might do as a rough estimate of whether this development is feasible. And so it takes in information like what are the expected rents or sales prices in a given part of the region, what are the estimated construction costs for building a given type of development, and then capitalization rates, cap rates, which are basically a way of valuing that income stream from an income property that help establish how much is the future development worth. And so by looking at those variables, the pro forma model that Johnson Economics, I want to give them credit, they have built the model that they've built is helping look at how viable a given type of development or redevelopment is. So that includes middle housing, it includes multifamily, et cetera. And then that's one component that feeds into an assessment of what's the likelihood of redevelopment. For vacant land, we just assume it's going to happen. But for if it's redevelopment, then if it looks good on paper, we look back at other things that looked good on paper over the last 20 years to see what percentage of them actually turned into redevelopment. If it doesn't look that great on paper, we look back at things that didn't look great on paper and see how often did we get surprised and something actually did happen, even though maybe we wouldn't have predicted that. So there's some redevelopment associated with both things that look good on paper and things that don't look good on paper based on kind of the historic rates that's happened. over a 20-year period. Next slide. So the purpose of the pro forma model is to help understand the viability of different types of development. So how dense of development are we likely to see in a given area? And then also how likely it is to see something change to a new type of use. But it's only reflecting market rate development. So it doesn't inherently have affordable housing in it. It also is looking only at, can a given type of development afford to tear down what's there today and replace it entirely? It's not looking at, can you add an ADU to your house? Could you convert your home to a triplex? Can it become a cottage cluster by adding units out back? None of that is part of the pro forma model. So those are things we need to get at separately. It also, because it's working at a regional scale, it's using generalized zoning the same way that the BLI is. It also doesn't have information about like tax abatements or how jurisdictions are using tax increment financing to incentivize certain types of development. It doesn't have that kind of granular local incentive information baked into it. So it's just taking a kind of broad brush based on the estimated market conditions and saying, this is a rough approximation of what redevelopment is possible. And that pro forma model flows into the redevelopment, but it also flows into the vacant land, which is why we introduced it first. So I'm going to let Clint talk about how the rest of the ingredients flow into the vacant land, and then I'll come back to the redevelopment component.
Next slide, please. So we have the buildable lands inventory, which basically starts with the raw acreage. So we're looking at roughly about 164,000 acres in the urban growth boundary. And so what we do, as Ted mentioned, we divide this up into vacant and developed land. So looking at the chart, we have this total acreage. We've got 7,700 vacant acres roughly. So a relatively small percentage of the total UGB. But that gray bar there is stuff that we just ignore. It's things, as Ted mentioned, like homeowners associations, parks, open space, rail properties, schools, that kind of thing. And so then the rest of the 110,000 is what we consider to be already developed. That already has a structure. It already has some sort of development on it. I should note that we do count like parking lots as developed, even though there is no structure on them. They are being used, so they will get fed into the pro forma that Becky mentioned as part of the redevelopment filter to see whether or not that pencils for those to redevelop. But the bottom bar here is what we look at, what we call unconstrained acres. Because we know that there's a lot of environmental constraints out there that prohibit development or limit it. So we have steep slopes, we have wetlands, so our Title III, Title 13, wildlife habitat, and floodplain stuff. So once you take out all those environmental constraints, we're down to about 137,000 acres total, with only about 4,600 of those being vacant. Next slide. That being said, that vacant land can be quite productive, and we look at this in two different ways. In the past, we have always, for single family development, we've sort of taken the entire parcel and looked at what the minimum lot size would be, and then sort of did a divide into that. It's a little more complicated, but the simple math is we would divide the minimum lot size into the total parcel size and then get the total number of units. Now with House Bill 2001, we're seeing a lot more middle housing. And so what we've done is we've gone to an expected density method instead. And what that means is, and we've always done this for the multifamily and the mixed use, which is the number of units that we would expect per acre. We've now taken that and put that to the single family to sort of better align with this idea of the middle family. Yes.
What are those numbers? The per acre numbers for each of these three categories? Sorry.
That is a good question. I don't have it right off the top of my head, but Becky.
I could probably pull it up for you in a minute.
Yeah, Becky can look it up while I'm talking, and then we can.
Just a quick question. Is this the slide based upon the 4,700 acres or the
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
70.
Oh, sorry. Ted was quicker on the
Click
draw
on the
here.
draw.
So we have a expected for the SFR one, which is our lowest category. So we basically have three single family categories, 1, 2, and 3. We're looking at an expected density for that sort of lowest density of about 13 units per acre. And then up to about 20 units per acre in the higher category. So it's 13, 15, and 20. So, but that's just for the single family. This is going to be inclusive of everything. This is going to be multifamily and mixed use as well.
Those densities are the blend of single detached and middle housing.
I
Or
believe
are
that's
they
right.
just-
Yeah, no, that's for the blend of both. But we do end up with, I mean, some of our multifamily zones go up to about 338 acres, or sorry, units per acre is our highest. So that's for like, you know, stuff that you'd see over here in Floyd District, some of these taller.
I live.
houses. Or where you live, yeah.
Madam
Um,
President, if, I'm sorry for the distraction. I think it would be helpful going forward if this slide could somehow define single-family housing and multifamily a little more with maybe the range of densities or something, because I'm not going to keep this in my head for the next time I see this slide. Maybe everyone else will, but I doubt it.
It's very helpful.
Good idea.
Yeah, and we have, I mean, I can produce all sorts of tables for you if you really want to dive into the data. Yeah, and there'll be plenty more tables to really dive into, but we're trying to keep it at a high level at least at this point. But yeah, happy to answer more questions. So that's our expected density method. And then we also take that vacant land and we put it into the pro forma model. And the only difference between what Becky was talking about and what we do with vacant land is that probability piece that she talked about, where we look at whether or not something is likely to redevelop. As she mentioned, we just assume that for the vacant land piece that it all redevelops. And that gives us a lower number. And that the reason for that is you might end up having the way that the pro forma model works is it looks to see what the highest and best use is through the economics. So we may look at a tax lot and say, oh, our expected density is 13, but then the highest and best use based on rent and pricing and everything else might actually bring that down to closer to 8 on a tax lot by tax lot basis. So that's why you end up having a smaller number for that pro forma model going forward. Let's see, next slide, please.
So on the redevelopment side, to get at kind of a range of potential redevelopment rates, because redevelopment is a place that has a particular amount of uncertainty, maybe even more so than some of the other things that the other parts of the system. So our baseline version of this is not exactly the market conditions that we're in today, because the market conditions we're in today are pretty tough for development. There's not a lot of development moving forward like right now. But so they assume a little bit of market recovery. Effectively, the interest rates come back down some, as a sort of average over a 20-year period. And then as that happens, that means that the capitalization rates come down some, and that basically means that the value of the property is higher. It makes it more likely to be worth building. It does assume we've been through a period of very high construction cost escalation, but things have flattened out somewhat at this point. So it assumes that relationship between our rents or sales prices and the construction costs stays about where we are today on average over 20 years. They're going to move like this over a 20-year period. That's how market cycles go. But we're not trying to predict those specific movements. We're just saying on average over 20 years, the relationship is something like it is today. And then we're looking at that redevelopment probability based on kind of how good it looks on paper, that we're looking back at the 20-year trend line for that. And we're saying, let's assume that kind of the trend we saw over the last 20 years is similar to what we see over the next 20 years. for things that look comparably good on paper. So one thing I want to call out is for middle housing, it's not saying assume we see the same amount of conversion to middle housing we saw over the last 20 years. It's saying if it looks good on paper to tear this house down and turn it into middle housing. And 20 years ago, over the last 20 years, things that looked good on paper happened 20% of the time. Let's assume there's a 20% chance that this thing will get torn down, for example. So it's not specific to middle housing. It's not specific to a given type of development. It's just saying on average over the last 20 years, when things looked good, they happened at about this rate. So
Counselor Lewis, that's kind of getting at your question about how it looks at middle housing.
Yeah.
Does that help?
It helps.
Good.
next slide, please. So from that, taking the developed land and running it through the pro forma model, I mentioned kind of what that baseline is. So we have a basically a 5% swing above and below in that relationship, prices or rents and construction costs. So if prices are on average over 20 years, about 5% higher than they are today relative to construction costs, then we get about 75,000 units of redevelopment. At baseline, it's about 62,000. And if we saw construction costs basically come up faster than rents or prices, so that it was about the rents were about 5% lower relative to the costs, we're down to 46,000 units. So overall, we're looking at a range between that 45,700 and the 74,600 roughly in terms of how many units in aggregate across the region we might see from redevelopment. You can see that a lot of those are multifamily. There's some middle housing, and then there's a little bit of single family. This is all net. So it's net of whatever was on the site before. So if you have a large lot and you can afford to tear it down and put several detached homes or some middle housing on there, that's where those small amounts of single family are
So
coming from.
if you don't mind me jumping in, I'll just summarize that this helps you see the range. So a high, a medium, and a low estimate of the number of units we might see in redevelopment during this 20-year time period. And it differs kind of with the assumptions you make about the market. The market improving has us at the top. The market being less positive over those 20 years has us at the bottom. And then baseline would be somewhere in the middle of those two.
So can we just stop here for a minute and dig into those numbers? Because pre-COVID, we knew we were 45,000 affordable housing units short. After COVID, we know we're higher than that. So we're already in a hole.
That's right. That's right.
So
And we're
how does
not,
that- how does that figure in that conversation get put together with this capacity analysis?
Council President Peterson, we'll be returning, I believe in June with the topic of the housing needs analysis that's going to get into the very questions you're asking. Eco Northwest has been helping us with that housing needs analysis work, which includes now not just looking forward 20 years, but also estimating existing housing needs. They've completed that work, and that existing housing needs piece looks at historic underproduction of housing as well as housing for those experiencing houselessness. So more to come on those topics.
yeah, the charge today, because you need to make an urban growth boundary decision, is about just kind of the physical capacity of land. But obviously, our ability to make up for the housing deficit that we have and our need to address affordable housing is extremely important. So that data will be really important, and it's coming.
Thank you. And to this, up until this point in the conversation, I've held back to just ask the broader question. Where were we challenged by the stakeholder group that was put together, and what has changed because of their input?
Oh, good question. So we've been presenting them all of this data kind of along the way. That's kind of one of the purposes of that group, was to make sure they understood this information and that they were asking questions about it along the way. While I'm talking, I'd like the group to think about specific data ideas that they've put forward, because I know that there've been a couple. But one of the primary ways that we're going to use a lot of the information that we've been hearing at the roundtable is incorporating some of those big themes into the urban growth report. So in addition to this data, you'll see some of the topics of concern. That roundtable ended up talking a lot about things like, why does it take development so long to happen on a parcel? And what are some of the impediments that are slowing down that process? Or how are we looking at equity in our data, and what data sets are we using, and what does that mean for the region? So there's several big topics that are much bigger than the UGB decision, which they're raising, and that we want to figure out where to continue those conversations and where to put them. So I think you'll see it come out in the urban growth report, and then we'll probably have some direction from Marisa in her COO recommendation for the UGB decision about where some of those things should move forward. And there's some great opportunities with the state now requires Metro to produce a regional housing strategy, which will allow us to dig into some of those reasons that housing isn't happening at the scale and the speed that we want it to. So that's an example of work that's going to continue after the UGB that we can put some of those topics into. And so having clear direction to staff about how to do that and how to keep it forward is what we're after. That was a very long answer.
No, and I think it's just relevant in the next steps of land readiness. I mean,
Yeah.
the legislature put $100+ million out there, and the governor's saying she won't sign it because it's not all related to housing. She wants proof that it's related to housing. We're going to need to show our work on land readiness for this region in order to be able to go back to the legislature and actually have any of this become real.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the bigger issues of our time, because the state is not invested in infrastructure in big terms. So if we're going to get any more money for land readiness, we need this justification on the need for housing and the need for employment, but we also need to show the number 1, 2, and 3 reasons why it could not happen, right? And how we need to make sure it does happen and does move forward, and that the state has a role.
I think the good news is that this data is going to help us move that conversation forward. But I do have to point out too, a lot of this is because we need to do it for the UGB decision, and it's going to be helpful for these really critical, important today decisions. So we'll be doing both.
So I guess in totality, I feel like where we're going is we're not going to say, oh, this is our job, we're just doing a UGR, but we're actually going to do the full systematic approach and continue the conversation and not just stop, which is great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's right.
Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam President. These presentations, as I try to connect them with the population projections, call the question of what kind of household size are you assuming in each of these different types of housing?
Councilor Nolan, that's the type of information that we'll bring forward. Again, I believe in June, when we get to the housing demand analysis, we're going to be breaking out demand for different life stages of homes. So household size, income, age of the household, or whether they have kids, that type of information to give some nuance to this discussion of what types of housing meet those needs.
Okay.
Yeah, today is very much focused on kind of physical space and product houses. It is we're not talking about people. And so that can feel like something very important is missing. We're gonna get to that. We're gonna be talking about the people. That is just a next step. So part of us delivering this information kind of 1 month at a time means that you're not getting the full picture yet, but that information is coming.
Okay, June seems, I mean, it's only 2 months, but this seems a critical piece of information and,
It's absolutely critical. Yeah.
okay, I'm eager for that information.
Yep. You'll get it.
Your +5 or -5% on market recovery or market erosion. Does that track with historic trends of swings in the market? Seems to me in the last, well, maybe not quite in the last 20 years, but certainly in the last 30 years, we've seen swings that are much bigger than that. So help me understand how this was determined and how it affects the projections.
Good question. So as I mentioned, the key thing here is how prices or rents and construction costs relate to one another. Because they're both gonna move over a 20-year period, and we're not gonna stay at the same costs that we are, the same prices we are today. And as I mentioned, they both do, they have swung by much more than 5%. They probably both will swing by more than 5%, not at the same times, right? You know, usually one thing will run up and then the other thing will run up and then, you know, they sort of move with a little bit of a lag. Over a 20-year horizon, we're not trying to forecast this one will run up in this way, followed by that one will run up in that way. We're just trying to say over the course of 20 years, a sort of average relationship. Do we think they're going to diverge where our rents and sales prices are really going to go up a lot faster than we see construction prices, costs go up, or more slowly than we see the cost of construction go up?
Becky, do you know from history if we looked back 20 years?
I
what
don't
that
have
average
that
might
number.
be?
That's a
What
good
the rolling
question.
average would be, for example, for the last 40 years, what the rolling average would be?
We could look at that. I don't have that number in front of me, but yeah, we could look at how that, and again, it's the, we'd have to look at the difference between them, but we could potentially look back.
And I understand not wanting to get too granular because if you try to predict, you know, this neighborhood or this city against
Or
the
if you
whole,
try to predict what's gonna happen in 5 years or 15, or we really want to look at that
right,
20
look
years.
back the last 5 years, and would we have
Mhm.
thought we'd be here today?
Yeah, we don't wanna do that.
I just also want to put a pin in comments others have made about how we will respond to this analysis as it applies to affordable housing. Because we have gaps in all levels of housing, but the chasm is in affordable housing. And that gets into policy and what do we want to change. But if we build just McMansions, there won't be enough demand for them. And we'll miss out on how actually sheltering people. So just put a pin in that and
Yes, thank you. We will put a pin in it. And I will add to just that we are in coordination with the housing department. So the data and information that we're producing, we're sharing and coordinating with the data that they're producing, and we'll be working together on this next step that I mentioned earlier, the regional housing coordination strategy.
Right.
So more to come.
Okay, Councilor Rosenthal and then Lewis.
Thank you, thank you, Madam Chair. First, just a comment on what Councilor Nolan said. If I remember some of the graphs of the past, those are fairly jagged peaks and valleys on a lot of these, you know, costs and things like that. And so, yeah, some sort of smoothing curve, what the overall trend is would be useful. My question is, at what point, I mean, single family, multiple family, and middle housing all have very different economic models, different costs, different land costs, different investment costs, et cetera, et cetera. Will we get any, shall we say, guidance as to what tools we might have as to how to tweak those particular distributions? In other words, right now there's a lot of people most of the contractors know how to build single family housing and make money. There's only a few of them that know how to build middle family housing and make money. And then there's a different group of people that build multifamily, and I assume they make money, but I don't know. So will we have any information that'll guide us in how we might influence that distribution of things?
It is a really good question and an important one that I think all of our jurisdictions are struggling with. Some of them are seeing middle housing happening and are getting a lot of permits, while others are not, and they would like to see more of it. So this question of what's needed to help the market come along and be producing these units is a really important factor. Our model is trying to anticipate their decisions, but it's not identifying those barriers. This, I keep going back to it, but this effort that we'll be taking on after the urban growth boundary decision for a regional housing coordination strategy is an opportunity to work with our jurisdictions, find out what they're learning about impediments, because they're the ones that are working with the development community on a day-to-day basis. They have folks coming in for permits. They know their codes. And I suspect that that's where the barriers are. We also have a great resource in our the UGR roundtable. We've got several developers at that table with lots of thoughts about why properties aren't developing. We heard a little bit about that from them last month. So, I guess that's yes and no. Yes, it's something that we're working on and we will continue to work on. And the information isn't readily available yet, but we're continuing to work on that because it's an important question that I think we're interested in at a regional level, but our jurisdictions are interested in it locally too.
Okay, thanks.
Great, Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thanks so much. I really appreciate this chart, I think, because it shows single family and middle housing types as fairly stable. Yes, there's swings, but there's sort of insignificant swings over the course of 20 years from my perspective. Where the real swing comes is in multifamily. And I think it's interesting that you call out the shift in the market that drives that. I think largely, based on my knowledge, multifamily is not to be financed locally. It's generally out of state, sometimes even international financing schemes that help make multifamily happen. And to that end, I'm curious if it's solely going to be a market recovery or market erosion question, but if that is not intersected with a reputational question. Because if I have capital that can go to any city or region in the country, am I going to bet on Portland right now is the question that I'm suggesting might be as important as the general health of the national or international market. Have you done any reputational hit kind of analysis?
That's a very astute observation. I would say we're using pricing sort of as a proxy for that. It doesn't capture everything to your point. There's appetite for people to live in the multifamily, which would show up in pricing and rents. And then there's appetite for investors to put their money into building the buildings, which would show up in cap rates is where that would show up in the pro forma. That's basically saying they would be willing to pay less for an investment if they were concerned about Portland's reputation. If they were less willing to put their investment into the region, you would see that show up in the cap rates where the value of that future investment would be less, and then therefore it would not look as good. It would not be as likely to pencil because the cost of building it might outweigh its value. So the sort of narrow answer to your question is that the consumer side of it is captured here. How much do people want to move to the region? we played a little bit with testing sort of a flattening of the rent curve, like what if Central City is less desirable, but the outlying areas are maybe more desirable? It didn't really change things as much as you might expect from the baseline. It did change sort of where things happen, but from a regional scale, it didn't change the numbers all that much. Because there are a lot of places in the suburbs where a little bit of difference in the rent might be the difference between it looks good on paper and it doesn't, or between a taller thing makes the most sense and a 3-story thing makes the most sense. So there's enough room for things to change in the suburbs that if overall the region is still competitive and it's just an issue of sort of Central City, we don't think it's really going to change things from the baseline all that much. If you saw the broader region have less appetite for investment and less appetite for people to live here, then it might be worse than the 5% we're showing. And to your point, 5% is a little bit of a like, pick a number out of the air. A 5% swing in rents is enough to notice, but not like a wild amount of swing. So it's like, I would say a 5% swing is probably about like, if we didn't really see people want to move here very much, you know, a 5% erosion, like that feels roughly right to me for what that would reflect. But it doesn't pick up on the cap rate side of the money not wanting to come here either. I will say I haven't heard that same response to the suburbs. I think it's been more isolated into Central City and kind of close in Portland. So I think because we've done that little bit of testing of, you know, what if it's just kind of isolated and it didn't change the numbers that much, I feel like it's probably not a big difference if it's just a question of Central City.
Thank you. And I think it's more than just Central City, because I think it's the reputational hit of, you know, the New York Times perspective on Portland, great place to eat, bad place to live. I disagree. But it's also the emotional and kind of costly process of developing with City of Portland versus developing with City of, let's just say, Oregon City. 9 times out of 10, I'll take Oregon City over Portland. So what, you know, when I hear that you've kind of flattened that, I don't think we've fully overcorrected for the fact that we've already seen that overcompensation by developers moving. And there have been some really successful projects in the burbs, just sticking up for the burbs.
So this is exactly the conversation that council will have in you deciding where you want to fall on this range.
Okay.
The information is going to be presented to you with a low and a high. And so these are the kind of things that are very hard to predict and that become a bit of an art. So you kind of will decide if you kind of think that that's what's happening and that's going to be the investment perspective from outside developers and inside developers going forward for the long term, then you would maybe trend towards the lower on this capacity range. And if you didn't think that that was the case and that things are going to recover and the perceptions of Portland are going to change over time, then you might put yourself at the market recovery. So that's exactly why we're bringing this to you in a range so that you can make those decisions. And you don't have to make them now. You get to sit with this for several months before
Great.
you have that
So
conversation.
can I just follow up on that though? It needs to be defensible.
Absolutely.
And so having a range based on some assumptions is useful. If we change those assumptions and we don't have the data to back it up at the time of the decision, and it's just based on a feeling, which I think is right and true, and we haven't remodeled it and we haven't looked at it to see how it changes things.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay,
You're absolutely right.
okay.
And that's why we'll give it lots of time to help you in that decision process and document it and make sure that the final numbers in December are defensible.
Okay,
These
So-
are all defensible in this range. That's what.
well,
we're
they're
presenting to you.
defensible scenarios.
Yes.
Yeah. My question is, where do we interject in a timely fashion these other models, these other assumptions to be modeled, rather?
Ted, maybe you can help me with that.
We'll do some homework on the questions about how pricing has swung around and how construction costs have moved around in historic terms to give some basis for understanding this.
And demand for moving out.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We do have, I think, 2 or 3 more slides to cover new urban areas and then give you the punchline for
We still have questions, Ted.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Yeah, yeah, thanks.
We're
And,
on council time now. Juan Carlos Gonzalez. council.
sorry. Thanks, President Peterson. Yeah, I'm just looking at the slide on the screen. Can you remind me the time horizon that we're looking at here with the preliminary results and the projection? Like, is it a 20-year horizon, 10-year horizon?
20
Yes,
years.
it's 20 years. Yeah.
Okay. And I think one of the things that and this kind of goes into that feeling, the piece that we were just talking about with President Peterson. So kind of, I want to put that out there, but I get this feeling that we all talk about, especially as elected officials, that we're in a housing crisis and we need to do X, Y, Z, et cetera. And so my question is, do any of these projections, and I understand that they're based in material facts that we need to project, do they help us, one, address for the backlog of housing and the new people that will be moving here? Or, I mean, like, how much progress would this get us to actually addressing the supply issue that has been in place for 15 plus years since the Great Recession? And if so, then anyway, so I guess that's the first question. Like, what is our housing gap that we have right now today, and what will it be in 20 years? And are we making measurable progress towards closing that, or will the gap stay the same?
Okay, so I will start. This data that you're seeing today is simply about the capacity of land inside the boundary, and it doesn't take into consideration the undersupply that you're talking about. But we will be looking at that specifically and coming back to you in June with more information about that underproduction and how we're going to take this capacity, put it together with demand, and present that information back to you. So you're just getting it one piece at a time. But that is coming.
Okay, thanks. I hope the spirit of my question comes through, though. I know that we're doing this in a kind of a piece by piece basis, and I'm struggling to kind of articulate the kind of the macro way that I'm trying to think about the issue in terms of, we know we have a housing deficit. We know what is potentially available within the UGB. We know what we've added to the UGB. We know what we will be adding. And even then, adding all those things together, how does our deficit look? If that deficit is still in the tens of thousands, then I don't know. I feel like we need to, as the region's planners, and as we give ourselves a lot of credit for planning for our region. If we're not able to plan for addressing that deficit in a way that is adequate, then I feel that's really concerning to me. So I look forward to seeing the data that you present to us. I don't know. I'm not going to make assumptions about what we're going to be seeing now and into the future. But again, I think we all on this council care about housing and closing that housing gap. And I want us to have real measurable targets anyway, I know that this is not necessarily an aspirational document we need to have based on facts, but if the facts are demonstrating one thing and they're demonstrating that we're going to be a structural deficit, then that's just broken to me. So anyway, I hope that makes sense, and rant over. Thanks. We can continue.
You, Councilor Gonzalez.
Counselor, I'm just gonna say what you've pointed out is, for me, yet another example of what we're supposed to be fulfilling on behalf of a federal requirement like the community engagement guide that was kind of became our minimum, and we want to do much better because we believe that the minimum is not where we want to be. I think this is a requirement by the state. It's a very specific designated analysis we're supposed to do. and I'm not gonna speak on behalf of our lawyers, but a lot of like case law goes into this and, you know, what's the box we can play in, but it's the minimum that we have to achieve. And then I think what I've heard from Aaron is that we're hearing that from not just the council, but our stakeholder committee, that there are bigger things that we need to use our authority and our influence beyond just this report. And
Thank
so
you.
I think this is beginning to feel like a normal case of Metro. Right, where we have a specific designated role, but there's a bigger issue at play, and we're trying to fulfill the minimum to get to the maximum. And how do we get to that maximum is the difficult part of the equation for what our authority and our influence is. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. And, you know, I think also, I mean, as the largest MPO,
Yep.
that, you know, if the system is not working, then going, you know, business as usual. I understand that this is an exercise we need to do, but I feel like we could be doing more, talking more about it more broadly. And I think we all agree with that. But anyway, I understand and I appreciate that.
I think you got nodding heads, so yes. All right, seeing no other hands raised, we have 3 more
No, there
slides.
is.
Sorry. Oh, so close.
Real hand.
A real hand, yes.
Yeah, Councilor. Flynn.
In that conversation that you and Counselor Gonzalez just had, I think to me, it raises questions that in typical Metro style, we kind of want to not deal with because they're tough questions. Specifically, how do we document any gap that exists now? There are 8,000 some odd apartments and homes available on Zillow, just within Multnomah County. I haven't looked at broader. How do we square that with a sense, or even is there documentation that there is an unfilled demand there when you've got housing stock waiting for someone to take it up? And I understand there are pricing issues around that. But we're dealing with market-driven projections here, as you said. We haven't yet come to grips with how we deal with affordable, not just meaning subsidized, but market affordable workforce housing. And given where we are and how far out we've pushed, how do we grapple with the ideal of a single family detached home on an acre with the constraints of providing infrastructure to a population that is that dispersed, and the impact of, if we do that largely with transportation that serves single passenger vehicle cars, what does that do with our other 21, 22 statewide goals? I just want to lay on the table that there are some tough conversations involved in this. And it's perhaps more comfortable to just let them slide in there under the conversation level. But I think we need to talk about, you know, is the demand that we want to give everyone single family homes, and the reality, both for economics, in infrastructure and environment, that's not really consistent with our climate values and our equity values. I hope we will have a time to talk about that and not quibble over whether this parcel can support 20 units or 8 units. I think our public deserves to have us discuss those values questions.
So we were just talking about scenarios and the scenario creation. This is data driven. with a lot of inherent assumptions. And what Counselor Nolan is talking about is policy scenarios where one thing leads over the other, one has priority over the other to achieve specific results. I don't know how to mesh those in my head right now. But I think that's the question on the table, is like, how do we get to December where we have a UGR that says, here's the magic range or number? But it's based on some policy assumptions as well as data assumptions.
Yeah, I think I'd like for us to work with that suggestion about how to bring that conversation back to you and think about it a little bit more. I do think that this process is going to offer you an opportunity to talk about policy in terms of what not just a decision about the urban growth boundary, but what maybe you want to see happen in any expansion area that you support with, if you choose to do that with conditions of approval, but also what you might want to talk about that needs to happen inside the growth boundary to encourage the kind of development you want. But I also think there's an opportunity to have conversation about the region as a whole and your vision and the policies. And that could happen in a 2040 growth concept update, is talking about the patterns of development in the region and what changes or adjustments that you want to see happen as we re-envision the next long-term plan. So there's a couple of opportunities where those might fall, and I appreciate the time for staff to figure out how to begin those conversations with you as soon as possible.
Because by default, we go back to the assumption built into the 2040 growth concepts, all of the assumptions.
Right.
And that is that we grow up and a little bit out. And the satellite cities take up some of that growth, and which is what we're seeing now. That's the basis, the base assumption that a little bit of everything happens. And that balances things out, both politically, financially. But it didn't have all the assumptions that we're working with today between racial equity and climate change. So,
Right.
Yeah. All right. We just got really mushy. Sorry. Back to the numbers and back to the slides. Oh, no. Counselor Rosenthal, did you have, okay.
Let's move on.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
But just to get us back to the slides, this one, remember, focuses just on redevelopment, and there are two other categories, the new urban areas and the vacant land. So I don't remember which one's next.
Next is new urban, I believe.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So this one's probably the easiest one. And basically, these are areas, as Ted mentioned, that are recent expansions that we don't have urban level zoning in place for to be able to run them through the models and look at the specific tax lots. So instead, we're relying on our local partners to provide us with the data that they produced when they did their concept plans. And then we just add those up. So Frog Pond, Hooper Mountain, they're all listed there. That ends up with roughly about 15,000 units of capacity that we've added in the last few years. So that one's relatively straightforward.
A quick note I want to say about those new urban areas. These are obviously, these are areas inside the UGB, but we haven't seen any development on them yet.
Right. So like River Terrace that was just brought in last year. They have an estimate of what they think it's going to look like. That's included in these numbers. Next slide.
So those were kind of the big three sources of capacity: the vacant land, the redevelopment, and the new urban areas. There are a few other things kind of at the margins that are going to adjust the total in addition to local review and all the sort of refinement of the numbers of the big three. The places that will add smaller amounts of capacity, we looked at office to residential conversion. We were talking about things that have been in the New York Times. That's also been in the New York Times a lot recently. Echo Northwest has done some research and analysis on that. Spoiler alert, it's not a large number. It's probably not going to really register on the level, the scale that we're talking about on some of these other ones that are tens or 100,000 units. It's going to be a much smaller number. Then there's also ADUs and middle housing conversion. I mentioned that the redevelopment analysis is just a like full replacement kind of testing. It's not considering the conversion or add-on to existing properties. So we need to account for that, and that number will still be, you know, relatively small, but it'll be bigger than when we were just talking about ADUs alone, because people do have more options with properties now. So that'll still be a relatively small number. And then the thing that'll take a little bit of capacity away is consideration of housing units that are being used not as housing, that are being used as second homes or vacation rentals. So that will come out of our capacity number. From what we've looked at, it's something less than 1% of Metro's existing housing stock. So it's not a massive number, but we will account for that anyway. And then next slide,
Can we come back?
these put those different, the big three sources of capacity together. The vacant land that Clint talked about, the redevelopment analysis that I talked about, and those new urban areas that Clint talked about. So when you add up, these are just total units, not broken out by housing type. But when you add up all those different estimates, again, this isn't 100% of everything. It's not the final answer, but rough first pass, between 145,000 and about 196,000 units overall in total of capacity. And so the refined version of this number with those couple of additions and little bit of subtraction, that's the number that ultimately will get compared against the need number to say, do we have enough capacity to accommodate our housing needs? And that's the last of the numbers slides.
Awesome. Counselor Wong has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. You know, I see office conversion and ADUs, but does the model incorporate any thinking around kind of like new technologies in construction? So like modular homes or mass timbers that might kind of impact how construction is done, and also impacts kind of like how pricing would work. And, you know, if on a policy level, if we were to support kind of that adoption, like would that change substantially or the model, or is that not gonna, in your view, like not something that's really gonna happen?
I would say it's not directly part of any of the models, but if the way that those show up is by reducing construction costs for something of a similar density to what we're already modeling, that might be one reason why you would see the thing that's framed as market recovery. It could be that rents go up faster. It could be that costs are lower, or that they don't escalate as fast as other things do. So that would, if it showed up as lower construction costs, that would be one reason to lean on the side of the market recovery scenario. It's not targeted to like, oh, this is what it would look like if it was mass timber, or this is what it would look like if it was modular. It's just one of those technologies could lead to lower cost construction, which could support more redevelopment and sort of moving towards the higher end of the redevelopment estimate.
But it wouldn't substantially increase.
It probably, I mean, it's hard to say with new technology that isn't, you know, here and fully operational at this point. Right now, mass timber is not offering cost savings relative to concrete and steel construction. It's not there yet. It's not to say it won't be over a 20-year horizon, but it's got a ways to go to be able to do that. So from, you know, where we are right now and what's foreseeable from here, I wouldn't say it would be, you know, a swing bigger than what you would see with that market recovery scenario. It's probably not even quite that big of a swing. It would take a pretty transformational like adoption, broader adoption and major changes to cost to see a bigger swing. And that's not, again, not to say that's impossible, but it's just hard, it would be hard to say that's a likely scenario
Right.
from where we are today.
Rest of it on that. Well, yeah, that is just how new technologies work. It's like
Yep.
requires some subsidy and then it's adopted and
Yep.
then it's the new standard.
It's hard to say
So,
when and if,
okay.
and to what extent that'll happen.
Okay, Counselor Lewis?
Sure, thanks so much. I guess I'm curious around your assumptions with vacant land in Damascus. And if you've called out those challenges separate from other vacant land challenges?
Yes, as I think Ted mentioned at the beginning, we are not considering that in these capacity estimates. Those are basically left as EFU land. Primarily because of those infrastructure concerns. From what we've heard from Happy Valley, they'll basically serve to the watershed boundary, because otherwise you have to build a new sewage treatment plant and that gets really expensive really quick. So yeah.
So that acreage was taken out off the top. It's not reflected in the difference between those two bars.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Are there any other parts of the region that are kind of at risk for not being developable because of lack of infrastructure plus a lack of local will?
Counselor Lewis, the other noteworthy one is West Hayden Island, which was added to the urban growth boundary, I think in 1981 to serve a deep water marine terminal need. And there's a long history with the city of Portland trying to balance the economic and environmental values that Metro has asked them to balance. And it's still in Multnomah County, not annexed by the city, not zoned for urban use. So we've been asked by the city of Portland to not count it as industrial capacity because of those challenges with governance and infrastructure.
Great, that makes sense. Anything in unincorporated Washington or Clackamas in a similar vein?
No, there aren't large swaths of land other than the eastern portion of Damascus and West Hayden Island that we've just taken off the top. Those are noteworthy exceptions that we felt required specific attention.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Wrap up, next steps.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Oh, one more hand I see.
Oh, Counselor Rosenthal, you never took it down, so I just assumed you did.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just first of all, a comment. It's interesting and bothers me a little bit, the skew, because all the existing development is all in District 3. And just the fact that it's so lopsided in this region indicates something about whether or not the 2040 growth concept has really been working as well as we think it has. It creates a whole bunch of problems, transportation, as well as basically creating a whole new city on the western edge of the urban growth boundary, which is problematic in some ways. But my question is, if we were to take your big development and we were to develop that over the next 20 years on 145,000 units or potential, where does that end? And let's say the population goes with it, 3.2, I don't know what the current number is used for an average population per unit. Where does that put us in terms of our projected population growth? Is that higher or lower or sort of pretty much on the same midline?
We're going to be putting this information together, the capacity estimates and the demand analysis, and put that together. That's what's going to come in the urban growth report at the end of June.
Okay.
So it's coming. I've said that a few times, so I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think part of our intent was to help, if we tried to deliver all of this information at one time, it would be a lot to take in. So by understanding this piece of it, when you get the next piece of the puzzle, you'll be able to dig into that one. And then when we put it all together, you'll see how it helps guide you and give you information that's helpful in making your UGB decision at the end of the year.
I just
Fair
also
enough.
want to note that we're in the process of putting the materials together to present that next piece of the housing needs. And so all of your comments and questions are really helpful in understanding what you want to hear about and what you want us to bring forward. So I would say, I know they're catching notes. I've been catching notes about some things that are of interest to this body to make sure that our next presentation has some of those pieces in it.
Thank you, Becky.
Madam President, because I know you like to prolong these conversations. That comment provokes a question from me, though. The UGM report is due to be completed in June. Does that mean that the conversation today is the last time we can impact what variables you consider? We talked a bit about the chart you had here about market recovery or erosion. That's not something that we can directly control, but policy changes is something we can control. And we haven't, as President Peterson pointed out, seen what those would do to these projections. And I'm hoping that we'll still have an opportunity to do that, because if this is the last chance we have to say as a group, here are the things we want you to model.
So the
We'll work
analysis,
through this.
yeah, the analysis will be complete, but your discussions about policy and your interest in discussing what you do with the information continues through this year
I
and
get
probably
that.
on beyond that. Maybe I didn't understand
But the
your
report
question.
is complete without having done the analysis about what impacts different policy emphases or even
Okay,
the existence of policies would have on those numbers.
well,
If we, in that 20 years, do another 1 or 2 affordable housing bond measures, that's a policy question in a way. And I presume it would affect these numbers.
well, it wouldn't affect the capacity numbers because the capacity is about the land that's available and how the market's going to respond to it. And affordable housing isn't a market response, and it uses the same land space that market housing. So this is just about the kind of the units that will fit and are most likely to happen inside the growth boundary. So no, that kind of policy wouldn't affect these numbers. But I will raise that we are going to present you this data today, and then we're planning on being back in June. And the data that is reported in the urban growth report will be in these ranges so that you can talk about the effect of policy and how you might want to land in that range. And then we'll do the analysis to back that up and provide a defensible data to support that decision. So that's what happens after the draft urban growth report comes out, is you work with us to finalize the urban growth report by December. So we have from June to December to land within those ranges and for council to finalize the urban growth report and make your urban growth boundary decision. Does that
So-
help?
It helps,
So
but
I-
I question your assertion that affordable housing bond measures don't affect capacity.
All right, let's take
Because-
that one offline to try and get through this conversation. But yes, I think there's a conversation there because there's also a land readiness policy and there's a whole bunch of assumptions built into. So, but I was just going to ask our attorney, Carrie McLaren, too, based on being an attorney and being in this professional in this space, helping dissect the different pieces and how we can affect things at different stages. Because I think we tried a couple ways that there is a desire. There's obviously always a desire, but like, how do we legally in this space walk through the requirement that we're supposed to provide, the policy overlay that we need to provide for the region, and an ultimate decision?
So thank you, President Peterson. I mean, I think your conversation as a council has hit upon a lot of those things. You do have to have basically an adequate factual base for making these decisions. So we've described them, and I don't mean to do this in any way that impugns or disparages as feelings about where our market is right now. And really the legal requirements are that we have an adequate factual base. And that's what, staff and our consultants have sort of laid out a range of analyses that we do of information that we take in terms of data. I think the attempt stepwise to look at the capacity first, and then the need is to really be able to dig into that factual base and discuss some of the parameters. I think what you're hearing from staff here today is that how they've scoped those edge zones allows for the council to have these somewhat more policy driven. And I will say, like, I would frame an affordable housing bond in the context of a policy. What's a strategy that this council might employ that would affect where we would reasonably land on that range? So I think that, yes, in terms of that broad range, I think those are sort of the outposts that staff is giving you to be able to scope a conversation within to discuss those strategies that we might be able to do to influence the region. I don't know if that addresses your question sufficiently. I'm getting some queries and maybe some nodding heads. So I'm going to pause for a moment and test that.
So in the grand scope of the Oregon Land Use Planning Program, and the way we have gone about being directed by the planning program, state legislative direction, for every 5 years to update the capacity and demand and case law now define the box that we're seeing before us.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
And if you feel boxes, because there is a box.
So Councilor President Peterson, yes. I mean, I think that is, the state requires that we have a buildable lands inventory. They give us certain parameters within which we can use as safe harbors for doing some of those estimates. They also, case law develops what is sort of reasonable. So when I say adequate factual base, there's a lot of case law that sort of dictates what that area is. And we have to separately identify what our buildable land inventory is. Then as a second component, we look at housing need. And that need is by housing type. It's not by the people necessarily that live in it. So this is where we get a little bit, I think maybe feeling constrained again, Council President Peterson, where we sort of translate, if you will, the likely income levels of people moving into our region into what housing type they are likely to live in. And again, I think what is a struggle sometimes, and another maybe layer of a box, is these are done at a regional scale in terms of broad generalities. And so we aren't getting into the granular that sometimes some of our different policy choices will make. So we separately do the buildable land inventory as one box that is constrained. We separately do a housing needs analysis that is also similarly constrained in terms of how we identify the new housing units that will not, new housing units that are needed. And then there is a sort of a equation that after that says, well, what's the deficit or surplus that you have? And if you have a deficit, deficit meaning you have more needed units than you have land, what are the places you might look at to expand the urban growth boundary to accommodate that need? They are relatively prescribed in each one of these areas. And I think an important additional layer, and this is not to sound as though we kick the can, is that this is done every 6 years, because knowing precisely what happens in 20 years is a challenging part. So if we have some market understandings right now and we think that that's going to relate to a particular amount of supply within our urban growth boundary, and we get that wrong, we are looking at this again in 6 years. And really, it's not even a full 6 years, because that's the decision cycle. So you pick it up again and you have the ability to look at it. So again, I don't mean that to sound like we deflect, but this is an iterative or ongoing process because of the challenges of predicting with precision into 20 years. So that's a more maybe fulsome answer. I'll pause there, President Peterson, and ask if there's anything else you'd like me to speak to, or any other members of the council.
I guess what I would like to ask is that when you show the overview of the timeline, maybe get back to us of like where policy starts to play out. And you already said you would in these different categories, but I think specifically for this conversation.
Yes.
And maybe even looking at the CO, some proposed based on conversation with counselors and stakeholders from the committee that we've convened, again, to those trend lines that we're hearing how would each of those, if you change the assumption, how would it impact? Is it a 1% more need? Is it 20% more need, or a 10% more capacity within the urban growth boundary? I think we need to know the ranges of these themes in order to get to knowing where we want to fall. Because again, I don't want to put us at risk. I feel this is one of the bigger, riskier things we do politically and for the future of this region, especially right now, when we're in the middle of the affordable housing and supportive housing service conversation of getting people into homes that just aren't there, that are affordable. So playing around with some of these and understanding how much more it would get us if we change these policies. But I think the hard part is defending it. Whatever it is in the end is the defense of it. And if we are saying that we're going to change policy, we have to do it on, we have to think about when we do it. Because we can't just do it on a hope and a prayer that the state legislature puts more money into land readiness inside the urban growth boundary. They've shown a little bit of interest, but not a lot, right? So we can't bank on that. There's no $100 million bank a year that we can say, look, policy change, right? So I think that's where we need to figure out what could be potentially real, what are we going to go after, and then what comes after the decision that we have to go after. Because there's a decision and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we could affect later in other cycles. But what can we affect this cycle? What can we affect in future cycles? I'm trying to dissect this in my head, but.
President Peterson.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. So this is, in my observation, this tension that's coming up between what the data is telling us and the box that we're in that tells us exactly how we put together this formula and the information that goes into that formula. The tension between that and that relies on the current state and the trends and the backcasting between the tension between that and what we want to be in the future and how we want to affect that. And I think that is what I've seen the members of the stakeholder table grappling with, is trying to keep that sorted as we walk through all these explanations. And I think I like your concept of the box, because this is a very defined process and with very defined inputs and outputs. But in the course of that conversation, policy questions are coming up. But those policy levers exist outside of this box and this process and this formula. We are collecting all of those. And I think we can absolutely look at the timeline and figure out when do those questions on the policy levers come up. But this is it's based on land, and land is a very narrow question, only one part of the growth of a society, the growth of a region. So we're happy to keep talking and figuring out, where to point out where those policy levers are. And then, what's happening next in this box that we're playing in.
So if I could make a suggestion to the counselors, questions you have around policy scenarios. And it would be good to share with the council what you're hearing out of the committee as well, of those themes that you're talking about.
Yep.
But to get more clarity on where we would like to test sensitivity.
Okay.
And in totally statistically stupid terms. But I think it would be helpful for me to know, what you guys are thinking, and then at what point in the process would we be able to work on those questions? Is it something we can work on right now, or is it something we have to wait till 2070? Is it something that there's an in between going into the next one that we want to change, or however that can play out? But I feel like we need to start that list of questions so that you can start thinking about where they play.
Yep, staff can absolutely begin that list based on what we're hearing in the roundtable, what we've heard from you today, and then we'll just build on it each time we come back. And over time, we'll put those into the schedule, and then over time, we'll just address them one at a time.
Okay. That sound like a solid moving forward plan? Because this is a really difficult process.
I'd like to
Counselor.
just make one comment if possible.
Excuse me?
Can I make a comment?
Yes, I called on you.
It strikes me that if, for example, we have now a projection of how much availability we have in terms of space, and we also have a population projection, if they fall exactly on the same line, the midlines actually line up nicely, then we're going to be debating methodology, where the methodology is correct. If they're way off, in other words, if the population that we can allow is larger than what we predict we're going to have, then we're going to be, or lower, then we're going to be having significant policy discussions. In other words, how do we restrict land availability, or how do we increase population growth? So I think I see that coming up once we get a little further down the process. But right now, I can see some interesting policy discussions that are going to come up.
All right. Right. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the help in moving forward through this process. Looking forward to the next conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
All right. Chief Operating Officer Communications.
Thank you, President Peterson. Just one update for you all today. Our budget process begins on Thursday. So we kick off then, and I just wanted to call your attention to an email that you received from our CFO yesterday about budget notes and budget amendments. We've created some templates for you to use to ease in the process, both one for notes and one for amendments. And just wanted to sort of differentiate between the two as you're thinking about the concepts that you want to bring forward. So a budget note should really be used to give direction on existing work. So you want to change or direct how we are doing something that we are already doing without big changes in moving staff capacity from one thing to another or funds from one thing to another. The budget amendment is for, and you'll see this reflected in the templates. The budget note is a fairly straightforward, 2 pieces, title and narrative. The budget amendment requires more information about, cost, scope, etc. And that is for moving money from one place to another, redirecting staff capacity from one place to another, doing new work, or spending new money that would be more appropriate for an amendment than a note. I also just wanted to offer that if your staff have any questions, your policy staff have any questions about those templates or need help scoping, thinking about all of our budget, all of our staff, all of our leadership is available to you to do that. And if you have any questions about that now, I'm happy to entertain them. Otherwise, I'm happy to turn it back to you.
Counselors, questions? Counselor Rosenthal?
Oh, no, not a question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Counselor Communication? Counselor Simpson?
Thank you, Madam President. Just a quick update on the Nexus event yesterday with GPI. Roundtable of industry leaders and stakeholders met yesterday to understand the gaps that exist in the region in terms of economic and workforce development for our industries. And we have a lot of upside potential. It was not all doom and gloom. We really have opportunity around workforce development, particularly in creating the infrastructure needed to get folks trained through community colleges, systems and all. The next one in line was green tech. And then the final was life sciences and research, which we have high probability of that sector growing. And then I want to also let the council know that last Thursday, I broke ground with the city of Gresham and our partners at Northwest Housing Alternatives for the Terracina Vista affordable housing complex, which is 91 new affordable homes in Gresham. And Gresham set out to build 187 units, and they have exceeded that by a lot. And 296 is where they are currently. So shout out to our partners out in Gresham. Mayor Stovall was able to join me out there as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Rosenthal and Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to report that we had a visit, an economic development visit out in Sherwood last Thursday. Councilors Lewis and Gonzalez were also present. A great shout out to my policy advisor Eduardo, as well as to the interns who arranged the whole thing and got transportation. It was a very interesting. They showed us all their industrial land development, as well as so we got a quick tour of the areas that they had just submitted their proposal for expansion of the urban growth boundary. So we got a brief tour of that, and they talked about industrial land expansion and job creation. And I guess I would leave it to Councilors Gonzalez and Lewis if they want to add something that they got particularly out of that visit.
No, thank you for helping host.
Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you, colleagues. I wanted to report back on the Clackamas County Coordinating Committee meeting held last Thursday evening. It was a good discussion. Obviously, the group remains committed to housing and transportation as the top two items for discussion, and the meeting was transportation focused, one with STIP funding and transit. Obviously, we know that Clackamas for a long time has asked that we make sure that the levels of service are more adequately distributed across the population in Clackamas. So there was good discussion there. Second item on the agenda was a response period to the NEPA for the Abernathy Bridge. But since the governor's letter has redirected how ODOT's moving forward, there will be no NEPA comment period, thus that item was null. The place where I do want to call your attention, colleagues, some of you also represent parts of Clackamas County and may be interested in attending the C4 retreat. The dates have been announced of the 14th and 15th of June. So that is an overnight. And again, the two topics of conversation are going to be transportation and housing, probably with an overemphasis on transportation getting ready for the package in 25. Thank you.
Any other updates? Seeing none, we are adjourned for today, and I will see you all here Thursday, April 11th at 10:30 a.m.